So where does the State Library fit into all of this? We're talking about largely government records. So where are we? Today we're going to look at the scope of Queensland immigration and shipping records, which actually means more than Queensland because people actually move all over Australia. And to look at some of the techniques to find immigrant arrivals. We hold the following: all available Australian indexes, that is from New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia, if they are available to us. Some, as you will realise from what Greg and Niles have said, will only be available at their particular archives. Increasingly, though, they are available on the web. We also have a website which brings together all the different indexes and in some cases the lists, useful websites for family historians. We have major databases such as ancestrylibrary.com and Find My Past. Now, unfortunately, for Find My Past, we have on-site availability only, not because it's our choice, but because it's the choice of the supplier. Newspapers. If you were to go into the reading room of level 3, which is just above us, you would see that most of the material on open access consists of Queensland newspapers, and they are a marvellous source and sometimes the only source of finding some people arriving. We also have books. I know this is a bit unusual these days, but people have actually written books on particular ships, shipping lines and particular journeys, and we collect books. Okay, so the first thing that you need to work out is when and where did someone arrive? I think Niles and Greg have pointed out that there is difficulty in being too certain about this, but if you can find some substantial evidence, some real documentation which tells you that window of time between when they were in the country of origin and the country of arrival, you're on to a pretty good start. Now, a death certificate indicates the time and place of arrival. But if they arrive in New South Wales and they come straight up to Brisbane, it won't show any time in New South Wales. And when numbers are rounded off to 35 or 40, be a little suspicious. It could be correct, but it might just be a nice rounding off. Look at things like documented events like births, which are often very different from what people tell you their dates are. In my family, the women change their ages just as they change their dresses, according to what is demanded for the occasion. The men did too, actually. Censuses, likewise, although they can vary from one to another and be unreliable, but they can still be an important way of working out when people were in England, for example. And naturalisations may provide you with that information of when they arrived or when they left the country of birth. So the last documented event in the country of origin and the first documented event in Australia gives that window in which to search for arrival. The information may be in obituaries. We've also found those to be incorrect. Diaries, sometimes more glamorous bit of information for a future reading public. Letters, but also other government records. Now, State Archives also has those, like parliamentary papers, votes and proceedings, police gazettes and hospital records. Sometimes those hospital records will give you that ship of arrival. Niles has already covered the fact that there were various schemes under which people could arrive. It's worth just remembering them. There could be financial help at some level from the government, from the church, as we saw from the Salvation Army, the Church of England, the Catholic Church and so on, employers, family and friends. There can be detailed records, but the amount varies according to the schemes involved and who was making the records, who the individual sometimes was. Unassisted passengers, that is, those who were not getting assistance from any of those people, there is often going to be very little detail. It could include, for example, just a surname, not actually a very good way of picking out an individual. And those unassisted people could be crew, including absconders or deserters, army and civil servants, and people who just paid their own way outside these groups. Even Billy Hughes, who came over with next to nothing, got off on the Duke of Westminster as a steerage passenger. For some people, it was a point of pride to pay their own way. To keep repeating what we all know, names can be heard incorrectly. They can be spelled variously by the person who had the name or by the person recording the name. I can remember somebody who was telling me his name was originally Orchinsky. When he got off the boat, well, you can't have an un-Australian name like that. The person recording it decided it should be orchard, as in a fruit grove, but didn't know how to spell it. So it became orchard. It can be transcribed incorrectly. That is to say, the writing may not be interpreted in the correct way as it's written. And, of course, it may change. A lot of people did take advantage of it, I'm sure for the purest of motives. But there you go. Place of arrival can be quite different from destination. People can, in fact, get off in Victoria. Their friends have sent them a letter saying, we've gone to Queensland, we've heard that the mining's better, and then they take off. Immigrants could travel by coastal vessel or other means elsewhere. And if they are just steerage passengers, they'll just be part of a number in most cases. And yes, we hear this term, they came together. They might have, not necessarily on the same ship. I have been called out to the desk to answer why someone's not on the list. When we look at the indexes, they find they came fairly close to the time, but not on the same ship. They may even be on the same list, but some of them came free, some of them were in some form of assistance, some of them paid their own way. So as Niles pointed out when he was going through the list, they're not always recorded as a family, but according to what scheme they came under. So they can be there on the list, but not together. Your search strategy can be very important. To use truncation, that is, cut a word back to its stem and use a wildcard. A wildcard that means anything after those letters, like an asterisk. Don't use any more information than is necessary for a searchable list. I realise that's a challenge with Smith. Mix up the terms you use. Use different ones and search widely regardless of what people tell you. Queensland immigration's a challenge all on its own. For the period 1848 to 1859, use the New South Wales lists. We were part of New South Wales. They are the very best records for that period because they provide you with the relations in the home country and the relations in Australia. We also have amongst the Queensland lists for that point, we have missing lists, and yet the very best lists can be in New South Wales. And there are 2 films. Of course, with the very best information, it goes to say there is not as good a copy as there is with the one that provides less information. But the one that provides less information often has the clue to the words that you need for the one that provides more. There were 3 private ships in that time. The Fortitude and the Lemur were non-government ships, and the Chaseley is actually part of the Queensland lists. Don't ask me why. The Emigrants from Hamburg is also very valuable. It covers all of the Australian state, or colonies as they would have been in that period. And even when there are lists for New South Wales, there is often more information on the emigrants from Hamburg. From 1860 to 1915, the indexes are on microfilm in books and on the net. Lists are on microform and some are being digitised. Queensland immigration, and I realise this is just pulling together what Niles and Greg have told you. Check National Archives for overseas and coastal shipping. Does everyone know what I mean by coastal shipping? People moving up and down the coast. Those ships were sometimes like buses. And the mid-20th century, check QSA for immigration files. I think both Niles and Greg gave us a pretty good indication of how labyrinthine it can be going between the two. Now, from our point of view, we're interested in all shipping lists. And one of the biggest challenges for us is to bring those lists together in a way that is intelligible for the public. One of our volunteers is trying to do that. He wants to bring all the immigrant and coastal vessels to 1964 together so that if we can find a list, we know who holds it. And he wants to link the indexes from various sources to shipping list references at the Library, National Archives and the Queensland State Archives. And he also wants to include information on individual ships, particularly important considering that there can be the same name for a number of ships. We're all aware of that, aren't we? We'll learn it in a painful way if we haven't. There are no immigrant lists on microfilm beyond 1915 at the State Library. And as you've probably realised by now, the original lists are government lists. They are archival ones. And although we may have copies, there is more at the archives, national and state. And Charlie's lists are organised alphabetically by the ship's name and by the ship's date of arrival. Now, we're still trying to work out how this extremely complex list can be made easier to use. We do have printouts at the microform desk, and of course what we're aiming to do is to make that generally available once it's all resolved. Our main website at the moment is Useful Websites for Family Historians. Now, our website's going to change. It's going to be one of those things we all just have to come to terms with, that this will happen, but always be prepared to look at the bars at the top and the sides, and what you'll find on a number of websites is the footer, a list underneath which is going to be just fantastic. So we've got our family history websites there. They are organised initially at a geographical level, and then they are organised alphabetically within those geographic areas. And we have little hotspots highlighted. So here we are looking at useful websites for family historians. If you wanted something for Australia and it was Australia-wide, you would select that. You can see that you go to Australia and you think, oh yeah, I want it to be something that's more than just Queensland or whatever. I might just go there. Now, we're talking about archives mainly at the moment, and so we have actually highlighted where you can go into those directly so that you're not always just chasing around the page. State records, we know you're going to want to go to online indexes, and state archives, you're going to want to go to their indexes, their guides, and their catalogue search. So we're trying to bring together those major sources, initially geographically, then alphabetically, and with links to the hotspots. Now we've got newspapers, and this is really a major way in which many of you will find out anything about some of these ships. And of course, in this particular case, we're talking about finding a Bartholomew Foley known as Bat Foley. We couldn't find him on the index, and of course, you know, this is obviously a very prominent Catholic family, so we went to the Catholic Leader. We've got not just the Catholic Leader, but the Methodist Times, we've got Baptist newspapers, selections of Anglican records. Look, religions were like clubs people belonged to. You know, you had to be in it. That was all there was to it. And what's good about these religious papers is that they're interested in people, not just in a local area, but right across the state. So what the Catholic leader told me about Bartholomew Foley was that he'd arrived in Rockhampton in 1883. Tells us all about his marriage and all his relations. But we couldn't find him. So Rocky in 1883, the obvious thing to do was to go to the Rockhampton Morning Bulletin. This is pre-Trove days. And we find, when we went to the Rocky Morning Bulletin, that he migrated to Queensland in 1883 in the Wahroonga. Now, there's only one list for the Wahroonga in 1883. At that time, in the 1880s, the ships were mainly coming through Torres Strait, and then they were putting their passengers off at each of the ports. And at each port, they would tell you which scheme. They were organised according to the scheme under which they came. Now, only 6 people got off at Rockhampton. And there, with my number 4 lens, high-powered to the max, amongst the 6 people, I found Pat Foley. Now, I looked at all the absolutely beautiful records that National Archives and State Archives have, but they don't ever seem to capture what we're really looking at. And I really had to blow this up to the max. And the reason why Bat Foley wasn't found is because he was recorded as Pat Foley, of whom there are several, I might add. But that was him. He was the only Foley, and there were only 6 people getting off at Rocky, so we're pretty sure we got him. Now, you can search Trove these days, which is fantastic for finding people if they're listed and if they, the text is actually readable, and increasingly it is because there are all these people up all night correcting. Thank God for that. But in addition to that, we've also got a couple of books by Winifred Davenport and Betty Mottram where they indexed the names of arrival. Now, usually these are the unassisted passengers, They list 6 names and then 140, 250 in assisted immigrants. But that's still very useful because although those pages are digitised, they're not always readable. And because they're not readable, they're not always findable. So this is the sort of thing you would find where the names are. This is Jackie Howe's mother, one of the Missy Stokes. Annie and Louisa went as companions to Mrs. George Leslie on the Darling Downs. They came from New South Wales. Both of them had arrived, one on the John Bright and the other one on the Templar, but they came up on a coastal vessel from Sydney with the Leslies, and they're recorded as the Mrs. Stokes. But of course, our relations will mainly be amongst the 12 in steerage. Now, I don't know how many times I'm asked to plot somebody's path between Sydney and Brisbane, but I can tell you most of them are going to be in steerage. And you can see how even the first-class passengers are listed. The Leslies are Mr. and Mrs. G. Leslie, there's Dr. Mallon, the 2 Missy Stokes, Mr. Russell and Mr. Swan. Not really clear identification. I've already mentioned the emigrants from Hamburg, which indexes people leaving from the port of Hamburg, regardless of Australian states. We were asked to look for Adeline Mask, who was arriving in 1873. And Adeline's sufficiently unusual so that we could search by her first name. And so what had happened to her name, it was Marshke, M-A-R-Z-K-E, had become M-A-S-Q-U-E. Sometimes when you're looking at databases that allow you to do a first name search, it can be worthwhile checking that first name only, just as it can be using the CD-ROMs for births, deaths and marriages with a first name only. Some people mentioned about people coming from overseas. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware, but Find My Past has from the year 1890 the names of passengers leaving England. And when you compare the names of the people leaving and the names of the people arriving, you can come up with some interesting surprises. Now, we were looking for the Doldings, and you can do this at home. This won't cost you anything to look at the index. So, you can get a transcript, that will cost you so much. You can get an image, that will cost you more, or you can use it at the State Library, which is free. We can see the Doldings listed there. We've got their ages, we've got whether they're male or female. We can see that William came in 28, Jessie in 29, and we can see the rest of the family came in 31. When we look at the lists, we can see three of them together, Jessie, Mrs Elizabeth Dolding and Bella, and their care of Thomas Cook, Berkeley Street in London. And Jessie, and this is the father without Jessie, just J-E-S-S-E, not I-E. The I-E is the daughter, came out as a clerk. Now, what we would then do is go to the State Archives, and we would search by the immigrant name, and we know that it may contain the name of the ship. Now, Niall's told you wonderfully about how to search that, even just by going to the main search index covering all the indexes, and see what we can find. And here's the sort of thing which came up when we looked. But we now know, of course, that there is more than just the shipping lists we could find if we went to that general search and we saw some of the documents we found. But you can do this initial search on our website, which has the advantage that at least all those lists are together. National Archives, as Greg explained, there is a separate search for 21 to 50, and you need to actually go to Record Search and select the section on the right. And they cover most of the migrants for the period. Shipping arrival records will also be held at the port of arrival and final destination. And there are fact sheets on the website, and Greg's put some of those fact sheets out there today. So they will be there to collect if you didn't collect them on the way in. I mentioned to go to the right of Record Search. Can you see this just here, to go to that 1921 to 1950 search site? Not immediately obvious there. And we put in the name Dolding, and this is of course what Greg's shown you, and we get those records, and he's explained why there's an initial only. And we'd like more to be done. The trouble is they're doing too well financially in WA for it to get on with it. I go back to newspapers. Newspapers bring a lot of things together. Now, Greg also mentioned we did a talk on the Doldings 2 years ago. What interested me, hearing both Niall's and Greg speak, is how much more is available than it was when we first looked at them. I looked at the Doldings. Does everyone here know the Ryerson Index? Okay, the people in Maryborough are obviously very, very busy indexing, because the Doldings are now all listed there on Ryerson. And here we see Mr. Jessie Dolding, as in the father, without the I in the Jessie. And it explains a little bit about why they came, because we could see that the daughter, Jessie, and William Mark came earlier. And it says that Mr. Dolding was born in London and at the age of 18 years joined the Royal Munster Fusiliers, where he served for about 15 years. He spent 11 years of that time in India and also served in the Boer War. He married Elizabeth Kent just prior to his discharge in 1906 and practiced as an accountant in Kinsale, County Cork. In 1931, his health necessitated his coming to Australia, and he and his wife joined their son Mark, and he spent the rest of his life around the Gayndah district. He's survived by his widow and 4 children, one son, William Mark, Gayndah, Mrs. J. Horner. So we're wondering why one of them's not hanging around there in Gayndah. She's in Belfast, and Mrs. J. Shingles, Brisbane, and Mrs. I. Adams, Gayndah. So it pulls together why the rest of the family came. And of course, once we know he's in the Fusiliers, we know that we can go and search Find My Past UK, because they have military records, but we haven't got time to do that today. Burnett Advocate, as much as I'd like to see it digitised, unfortunately, it has not been done yet. Reminder, there are a lot of newspapers which haven't been digitised and which are worthwhile searching upstairs. So why search other state lists? Remember that Moreton Bay was part of New South Wales until 1859, and for that period the best lists are there, unless they're the Dunmore Lang ships, when you've got to look in those places mentioned and which are in your notes. It's forgotten or unknown that family may have been elsewhere first, and the ship arrived first at a port in another Australian colony or state, so the names are recorded on that list, not necessarily the Queensland one. New South Wales passenger lists, we have assisted, 1826 to 1896, unassisted 26 to 1922. Some indexes are on the net, State Records is, and of course they're at useful websites. So you go to useful websites, New South Wales, online indexes and immigration and shipping. Also ancestrylibrary.com. Lists are on the microform and they're on the net. So sometimes people will look on the net because on the microform because it's an earlier generation, or they want something they're not happy with in Ancestry. This is what the index to shipping looks like for New South Wales, the assisted passengers. These are the ones with greater detail. And you can see Moreton Bay is listed there. You can also see that you can get digital copies of Bounty immigrant lists for that period. Now, there is an online copy service. If you wish to pay it, that's fine, but the State Library will supply it without charge. So remember how much New South Wales included and when it included it for those very good records for that period. Now, we're looking for a Patrick Mooney who came out and donated land to Enoggera State School. Now, Patrick Mooney is an Irish cliche. You can spend quite a bit of time looking for him. When you've got a common name, try to use the least common name. Every time you add a syllable, you add, the potential for mistakes. He had a daughter, Anastasia. We know that from his death certificate. Now, Anastasia can be a nightmare. The trick with a name like that is to truncate it, that is, cut it back to a stem and use a wild card. Now, so we've cut Anastasia back to AN. The wild card for state records is a percentage sign. If we submit that, and we know that he was here by 1851 because his death notice is in the Moreton Bay Courier, we get Anastasia Mooney, and we get and family, which of course it's Patrick we're really after. There are just too many Patrick Mooneys. And we can see that there are two reels, 2136, 2461. They're at State Archives. The higher numbered reel, and this is in your notes, contains the greater amount of information. Once we get Mooney, and we know that they came in on the Cornwall in 1850, we get rid of Anastasia's name. We put in the year, the ship, the surname, because we want all the Mooneys, not just Anastasia. And here they are. Here's Patrick, lying about his age, 40. Always remember they'll say whatever it took to get that free passage when they're not terribly well off. So it's really Patrick we're after because he donated the land for Enoggera State School. And in this case, they're all together. Now that we've got that, here we can see this is the more detailed record. This is the Immigration Department list. We can see Patrick Mooney wasn't fooling anyone. Note there's a question mark next to his age. He describes himself as a farm labourer. He's from near Tipperary, which is pretty useless. His parents are Roger and Anastasia, both dead. His wife, Margaret, is 38. She's a dairy woman. She came from Ulla in County Limerick. Her parents are William and Joanna, Brian, and of course that will have about 3 or 4 different spellings depending on who's filling out the record. She'll be O'Brien, Brien, etc. And she's still got a father living in Ulla. Now, they have no relations in the colony, but can you see how valuable those records are pre-59? In this case, These people went into Sydney. They did not go into Moreton Bay, but it's exactly the same search procedure. And of course, things weren't going very well in Sydney, so what does the government do? It says, oh, right, we'll give you a free passage to Moreton Bay. And they were one of the 26 who came straight up. And you will never see any record that they arrived in Sydney, but they did. And of course, there are their children, house servants. Okay, there's also an immigrant agents list, and that's much more readable, but it doesn't have the information about the relation in the colony or the family back in the home country. And it's often that family back in the home country you want to make the link to the home country. So that's the assisted ones. They're the ones with the greatest amount of detail. What about unassisted? Now, there are index and lists of unassisted passengers 1826 to 1922. There is also a website, Mariners and Australian Waters, but it's not a complete index at this stage. And Ancestry.com, on-site availability only, but you can search it. We've also got indexes to vessels arrived, 37 to 1925, and indexes on the web at state records. And lists are on microfilm and on Ancestry. Victorian lists, we have indexes on the web, useful websites for family historians. Online indexes, you go to Victoria, online indexes and records, and they have the most complete records. They have assisted passengers to 71, unassisted 52 to 23, and that includes some unassisted, and outwards passengers, that is people going interstate, over to New Zealand, or even back home. Ancestry has indexes on the web, and the lists are still on microform, except for outward passengers, which we don't have at this stage. Now, this is the kind of thing we're up against. I apologise for the poor quality, but this is really what we're dealing with very often, especially with the Victorian records. This is intriguing that we ever got this query. It was addressed to State Archives at the National Archives address. It was handed to John Oxley and then handed on to us. And it started off with, I've been searching for the last 10 years. And the story was the family, this particular man, had come to, James Roger Wilkes had come to Queensland especially to build the first gasometer. Now, this is the Lusitania. We can see it went to Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney. It's always worth looking at that front page to get the detail. Now, here is James Roger Wilkes, riveter, and he is going, can everyone see this in its very poor fashion, to Sydney? So he's on a Victorian list going to Sydney. Okay, right. Here is the rest of the family the following year, and again, another rather imperfect list. There is his wife Anne Maria, a nightmare, Ada, Maud, Edith and James. I didn't search by Anne Maria. I searched by Ada to get this, and they were from Staffordshire. And that's quite common, where someone in the family comes up, sets things up for the family, and then you get this chain migration of other members of the family. They're on the New South Wales list. And then, of course, we know they moved to Queensland because then we see the babies being born in Queensland. He might have come especially to Queensland, but he didn't come to Queensland first. And we find James Roger Wilkes on a Victorian list coming to Sydney. Can you see how labyrinthine it is? Message, check everything. Now, here we have the Catania. This was for a German gentleman who they had paid for the 62-year-old grandmother to come to Australia. Now, the Australian government's not going to pay for them because at 62 years of age, you were just too old for anything. So the family paid. She's unassisted. She came to Queensland, and they know that. You know, this is his grandmother. He was a very old man. I hope he's not watching this. So we actually found her again on a Victorian list. 62 years of age, 1886, he knew all that, and he just stared at the list and he said, but it can't be her. she didn't go to Victoria. She came to Queensland. There she is, Mrs. Habrecht, 62, 1886. How do we start looking at it? Well, this is how we found her, because he did tell us that even though their name was Habrecht, it often just got elided into Habr. In this case, the wild card is an asterisk, and they should tell you those things at their website. And we can see it on the outward passage coming up to our little corner of the world, going up the coast. This is the outward passengers. And here she is on the Catania. And notice they've spelt it differently again with a D. So we're seeing her coming up to New South Wales, but we cannot get her that last leg to Brisbane. Charlie went out and checked it. Charlie's really onto this in a big way, and we could not find it. We know she came to Brisbane, but the record's not there. So sometimes you've got to think of other possibilities. And, of course, we had found her once we got to New South Wales. There she is with yet another spelling of the name on Find My Ancestry. There she is. We've just put in the name because she was Mrs. Habrecht. And 1886 on the Catania, because we know all that now. And now she's Helene Habrecht. So always be careful of trying to put less rather than more, because there aren't going to be too many Habrechts on the Catania, 1886. But that's been a pretty lucky one. Very often, all we're finding is a surname. But here we can see, here she is on the list. Sometimes nothing else, but in this case we've got Helene. Mini Curd. This is one that somebody found at home because the index to find my past is free. And it said she came to Brisbane. They looked up the records, couldn't find her, came in here and said, can you find her? Here she is on a Victorian list. Port of destination, Brisbane. Do we get the message? Search everything. Now, this is another problem we have. People have got this obsession that they know the ship's name. And they know that because their grandmother told them, or it's recorded in the family Bible. But it's often wrong. Even at the time, it's wrong. So the John Fielding ends up being recorded in some years later as the John Fielding. It's in fact the John Fielding. The La Rochelle, a French term, but the people on it were German, so it became La Rochelle in the German style, or the La Rochelle, because they're hearing it. The Genghis Khan became the Genghis Khan, but in fact it's the Genghis Khan. The Wurrunga, again, sometimes with or without an H or a double O. And I'm trying not to put too many variations. There are many more than that. The Normahal, they anglicised it to Norman Hall, had no way of finding it. The King of Algeria, and I had this man travel 200 kilometres to tell me I was to find this, and he said they came in on the King of the Algiers. Well, he never ever found it because he always put that in, and it was the King of Algeria. The Bejapor's been recorded as the Belfapor, and the Lusitania as the Louisa-Tanya. And I only picked that one up because I rang her. And, of course, it was one of those things where he might have come under a different name. They're not really sure where he came to. And, you know, she's Australian-born, but just had, that little bit of an Italian. And she said to me, but we think he came on the Lusitania. And, of course, bingo. Louisa-Tanya is how I would say it, but she ran it together as Louisa-Tanya. And, of course, I immediately picked up it was the Lusitania. The Cato Wattel, I've seen at least 6 different variations on that. The Cato Waddell, the Catur, K-A-T-U-R, all sorts of things. The Gauntlet's been recorded as the Colette, and the Raja Gopal as the Roger de Paul. The ones in black are the correct ones. And these are just some of them, and a number of them have many variations. Be careful of the name. It might put you off, where if you looked a bit more widely, you might get it. Okay, a bit of an overview of assisted immigration. The first ship with free government immigrants arrived in Sydney. The number of immigrants in a period was affected by economic factors such as drought or unemployment. Nothing's changed. And invariably, as soon as they got immigration underway in a big way, there was an economic downturn. 1861 to 1900, the population increase was 766,000, 750,000. Assisted immigration contributed half the total. 1831 to 1980, 3.1 million migrants received assisted passage. We're looking at huge numbers. Databases that we have, on-site access only, you need a Queensland library card, ancestorylibrary.com, Find My Past Australia, UK and Ireland, off-site with a Queensland library card, 19th century British Library newspapers and the Times Digital Archive. It goes without saying, I haven't sort of sung the praises of Trove yet, but is there anyone who's not aware of Trove? Because if you're not, you should certainly go up to talk about it to the staff on level 3. You can use your free e-services card to log into these services. You can have internet access here for 3 hours a day, home access to some databases. You can check our catalogue online. And again, that makes it so much easier when you come in. And you can order closed access items before your library visit. Role of State Library, it's to provide information services for all Queenslanders, not just the people who come into the library, on-site and remotely, in the most appropriate format. We do up to 2 hours free research per inquiry with a maximum of 12 hours per year. We've got an Ask Us on our website, as do National Archives and State Archives under their Contact Us. You can make your initial inquiries through that website. Just a reminder that we don't do a whole family history, but we support those doing research by looking into some of these things. Up to 12 hours a year, 2 hours per inquiry. So material is indexed on the net, on microform and in print, but as Greg pointed out, increasingly it's being digitised at a very rapid rate. Search widely and flexibly. Yes, listen to what people say, but don't always believe it. Lists are usually on microform, but check ancestry.com and SLQ's useful websites. Use the National Library newspaper site for lists in newspapers. Check our newspapers, which are still more extensive than Trove.